The storm had a way of making the old house breathe, boards exhaling with every gust. Arthur stood in the doorway of his kitchen, coffee gone cold, listening for nothing in particular. Rain marched across the porch roof, 1,000 small feet beating time. The clock over the sink stuttered, then steadied, like it too was deciding to keep going. He hadn't spoken to anyone since Tuesday, unless you counted the radio that never answered back. Outside, the streetlights bent halos into the downpour, fuzzy and tired. That's when a sound threaded through the rain, thin as fishing line and just as stubborn. A mew, high and fragile, like a question asked through a closed door. Arthur set the mug down, felt the echo of its ceramic click in the kitchen's emptiness. He pulled his sweater from the chair and opened the front door to the wet night. The air smelled of wet leaves and dark earth, a scent that tugged at old autumns. Water ran off the eaves in silver ropes, pooling at the bottom step. At the curb, under the sodium glow, a small shape hunched in a widening puddle. Not moving, not looking for shelter, just holding to a spot like it meant something. Her fur clung to her bones in thin spikes, gray with rain and road dust. She blinked slow, then closed her eyes, as if seeing cost too much. A car had been there earlier, he realized, tire tracks dark and recent. They curved in like a signature, then out again, leaving the space emptied. The kitten stayed, a small stubborn lighthouse in the wash of water. Arthur felt a familiar ache, the kind that starts in the chest and travels to the hands. He stepped off the porch, knees complaining, the hem of his pajama pants drinking rain. "Hey there," he said, voice low, like he was talking to a skittish memory. The kitten flicked one ear, then went still again, as if waiting was a job she took seriously. Up close, he could see the tremor in her sides, a tiny bellows pumping against the cold. No collar, no box, no evidence of belonging, only the shape of where a car had been. He crouched, bones protesting, and held out 2 fingers that smelled like old coffee. She sniffed, then wobbled to her feet, not to come toward him, but to settle right back in place. As if a line had been drawn around that puddle and she was its keeper. "All right," he breathed, rainwater running down his neck. "We'll do this your way." He backed away, careful, as if he were leaving a sleeping child. In the kitchen, he tore an old bath towel from the drawer and found a can of tuna. The can opener's rasp filled the silence, metal teeth chewing through the lid. A smell rose, heavy and familiar, taking him back to summers when his wife fed strays on the porch. "We don't choose who finds us," she used to say, tapping fish onto a plate with a soft smile. Arthur placed the plate under an upside-down mixing bowl, a makeshift umbrella against the storm. He went back out, holding the towel like a promise and the bowl like a small shelter. The kitten watched him with eyes the color of rain clouds, unblinking, unhurried. He slid the bowl close, tilted just so, letting the smell drift without the food drowning. She sniffed again, then lowered her head, eating with the carefulness of someone being watched. Even then, she didn't step out of the circle the rain had carved around her. Neighbors' windows held faces, flickers of blue light from televisions painting their curtains. A porch across the way creaked, someone shifting behind a screen door, curious but still. Arthur felt the town looking without coming, the way people do when they're not sure it's theirs. He tucked the towel around his shoulders like a cape he didn't deserve. "You can come in," he told her. Not louder, just closer, words falling into the rain. She lifted her head, whiskers dripping, then sat, tiny paws rooted to the cold water. Not defiant, not afraid, just certain of where she had to be. The old man looked down the empty road, watching tail lights that were no longer there. He knew something about staying where love last stood, even when it made no sense. Memories have their own weather, he thought, and sometimes you just wait it out. He fetched a cardboard box from the hall closet, lined it with a flannel shirt, and set it by the curb. The shirt smelled faintly of cedar and old soap, the kind of clean that feels like a hand on your shoulder. He laid the towel over the box edge, building a small roof that sighed under the rain. When he tried to lift her, she went light in his hands, no struggle, just a silent plea to be put back. He did, heart pinching, and the kitten circled once to align herself with the invisible line again. "You're waiting," he said, more to himself than her, as if naming it made it softer. He set the box so close it kissed the puddle's rim, willing the border to blur. She eased one paw onto the flannel, then retreated, loyalty stronger than comfort. Arthur wiped his face with a wet sleeve, laughter and sorrow tangled in his throat. He remembered a hospital chair and a window where he'd waited through a different storm. The rain slackened, losing its temper, turning from fists to fingers drumming on the street. Somewhere, a train called out, long and lonely, a sound that always found his bones. The kitten blinked at him, slow trust edging in like dawn under a shade. He sat on the top step, knees hugged, jacket damp, letting time move without rushing it. "I'm Arthur," he said, "because names make you real, even to yourself." She answered with quiet, the kind that holds space for what might come. A bicycle rolled by under an umbrella, the rider lifting a hand in a small salute. Arthur nodded back, a wordless pact among witnesses. He almost stood to go inside, to bring a second towel, to warm his old hands. That's when he saw the car at the end of the block, idling under the broken streetlight. It sat there like a secret, engine low, white steam ghosting from the tailpipe. Headlights off, wipers beating, the silhouette of a driver, a dark cutout behind fogged glass. Arthur felt his breath shorten, the way it does when the past pulls up without an invitation. The kitten didn't move, eyes fixed on the place where the puddle met the road. A door latch clicked open somewhere in the noise, metal speaking in a tired voice. He rose, joints complaining, towel slipping to the step like a shed skin. For a second, the car's brake lights flared red, staining the rain with color. The engine revved, then settled, then revved again, as if something inside couldn't decide. Arthur took one slow step toward the street, heart tapping out its own code. And from the idling dark, a figure stepped into the rain. The figure was slight and hooded, rain stitching the fabric to narrow shoulders. They paused at the mailbox, hand touching it like a landmark you visit when you're lost. The porch light threw their face into shadow, a smudge where features should be. Arthur felt the urge to clear his throat, to make a sound that would anchor them both. The kitten made a small noise that was not quite a cry, not quite a sigh. "Is she?" Arthur began, the question catching on the edge of his teeth. A nod, barely there, then a shake, as if agreement and denial were fighting under the hood. The person stepped closer, sneakers leaking water, laces dark and heavy. They looked down at the puddle like it held a map only they could read. "Her name is Mabel," the voice said, thin, young, and full of apology. Arthur tasted the name in the rain, soft as a lullaby and stubborn as a stone. He saw the way the kitten's ears turned, the syllables tugging at her like a string. "You came back," he said, and the words felt simple, like setting a cup on a table. The hooded head lifted, a face unspooling from the dark freckled, raw, maybe 17. Eyes read the way tired eyes go, not the way angry ones do. "I didn't want to leave her," the kid said, blowing steam into the night. "My dad." The rest slid away, swallowed by a shiver that had nothing to do with cold. Behind them, the car idled like a held breath, a presence more than a machine. The kitten stayed in her circle, tail wrapped tight as a promise. Arthur felt old and useful at the same time, a strange relief. He held out the towel, a square of warmth in a wet world. The kid glanced at the car, then at Arthur, then down at Mabel. "She won't move," they whispered, the confession riding a tremble. "She thinks this is where I'll find her if I get brave enough." Arthur nodded, the way you do when your bones recognize someone else's story. "You did," he said, the words small, the meaning not. The kid knelt, water pooling at their knees, hands open on their thighs. "Mabel," they tried again, softer, the vowels rounding like a lullaby. The kitten lifted her head, whiskers jeweled, considering the distance between love and fear. She reached her nose toward the edge of the towel, then tucked it back into herself. Neighbors shifted in their houses, floorboards complaining, curtains breathing in and out. A porch light 2 doors down clicked on, moths smearing themselves against its glow. The town wasn't nosy so much as hopeful. Everybody wanted a different ending. Arthur felt the old ache of choices, the ones you make when it's still daylight. He thought of his wife saying, "We rescue each other," over a pan of tuna. He thought of the hospital chair, of how leaving and staying both hurt. He laid the towel over his forearm and extended it like a bridge. "Take her when she chooses," he said, voiced the weight of a hand on a back. The kid nodded, eyes bright, guilt and love braided into a single line. Somewhere, a thunderhead grumbled, distant now like a scold softening to a sigh. The car door opened, a hinge complaining, and a heavier set of footsteps joined the rain. A man's shape, squared by habit, coat too clean for weather like this. He didn't hurry, didn't slouch, just moved toward what he'd already decided. "Let's go," he said, voice blunt, eyes missing both Arthur and the puddle. The kid flinched, fingers curling, then flattening, a tiny rebellion that didn't make noise. Arthur stepped sideways, not blocking, just existing where a wall needed to be. "Evening," he offered, the word a porch light. The man's jaw worked, a muscle ticking like a metronome out of time. "That's our cat," he said, and the claim hung in the air without a name attached. Under the towel's edge, Mabel closed her eyes, choosing stillness as armor. "No collar," Arthur said, keeping his tone level, like setting a plate on a table. "She's wet, cold, and stubborn," he added, letting a half-smile find his mouth. The man's gaze skated over him, then stuck on the kid kneeling in the street. "You did what we talked about," he said, the words too loud for their size. The kid didn't answer, which was an answer. Rain made a curtain between them, thin threads catching the porch light. Arthur felt the pull to say too much and chose not to. "Maybe we dry her," he said instead, simple as a recipe card. The man's eyes hardened, turning decisions into shields. "We're going," he repeated, and reached down with a hand that took, not asked. Mabel's body went tense, a violin string too tight to play. She didn't hiss, didn't scratch, just pressed into the wet as if it could swallow her. The kid lifted both palms between the hand and the cat, an offering of paws. "Please," they said, the words so soft it almost didn't survive the rain. "She remembers where I left her," they added, voice fraying into threads. Arthur watched the man's mouth pinch, watched the kid's shoulders square despite the tremble. "We can fix the leaving," Arthur said, surprising himself with the certainty. "Not by dragging," he added, the sentence landing like a coat laid over shaking shoulders. For a heartbeat, nobody moved, even the rain seemed to measure itself. Then the man's fingers flexed, an argument playing out between knuckles. The street muttered with new sound tires biting water, faster than careful. A second car rounded the corner, headlights swelling, white bellies of light charging the curb. The kid twisted, one hand on Mabel, the other up in a reflexive stop. Arthur felt his feet decide before his head did, the step already leaving the step. "Hey!" he barked, voice finding a size he hadn't used since coaching Little League. The first man turned, coat flaring, the scene slicing into separate frames of motion. Mabel lifted one paw, the line of the puddle suddenly a cliff edge. The new car's horn split the rain, blunt and unmusical, a demand without patience. Arthur's towel slid from his arm, a small flag falling between light and dark. And the kitten at last moved straight toward the street. The horn stretched the night thin, a flat note that shook the wet air. Arthur stepped off the curb with the towel up, a clumsy lighthouse in plaid. Headlights swelled to the size of windows, then tilted hard left with a hiss. Tires shaved the gutter, flinging cold water up his shins like slapped paint. Mabel froze with one paw in the road, claws finding nothing to hold. The driver's face flashed past, white and startled, mouth an O that said sorry. The car shuddered to a stop straddling the lane, hazard lights beginning to tick. Arthur's breath came hot and fast, fogging the rain between him and the kitten. He dropped the towel low, making a soft wall the size of a heartbeat. Mabel stepped back into the circle, tiny chest jerking, duty-fighting instinct. The passenger windows slid down, warm air and peppermint spilling into the storm. "My God," a woman said, "I didn't see her," voice steadying as she spoke. It was Miss Rivera from the clinic, hair plastered, scrubs tucked into rain boots. She angled her car across the lane, hazard lights winking like reassuring hands. "I've got a spare blanket," she called, already reaching behind the seat. Arthur nodded, grateful for competence that didn't need to announce itself. The kid wiped their face with a wet sleeve, eyes glued to Mabel's trembling sides. The first man stood back a step, coat collar lifting as if it could argue for him. Rain softened to a steady whisper, the storm running out of ways to shout. In the hush, the kitten made a small rasping sound that pinpricked Arthur's heart. "She's cold," Arthur said, more observation than alarm, letting the facts do the work. The man's jaw clicked. "We're taking her to the shelter in the morning." The kid's head shot up, a quiet flinch that said morning was a cliff. Miss Rivera draped the blanket over Arthur's forearms, turning the towel into a cradle. "Now we warm her," she said, the words simple as stitching. The man looked past them to the neighbors' windows, lights watching like worried eyes. "We can't keep her," he muttered, as if the street itself had put him on trial. "Sometimes keeping isn't the point," Arthur answered, surprised by how clear that sounded. Mabel nosed the edge of flannel, choosing between the ghost of a car and the shape of a hand. The kid whispered, "I'm sorry." And the apology fogged the kitten's wet whiskers. "He said I had to," the kid added, words falling like pebbles into the puddle. "Landlord gave us a week," the man said, the truth dragging his shoulders down. "No pets, or we're out." "I thought—" He stopped, breath hitching on pride. Arthur remembered his own notices, papers that smelled like toner and panic. He said, "The word a clean plate set in front of a hungry person. Tonight she stays dry. Tomorrow we make calls." He met the man's eyes and held them. The kid reached one hand under the towel, palm up, letting the rain find the gaps. Mabel leaned, testing the new ground, a feather's worth of weight on new promise. The puddle tried to tug her back with a lace of ripples that didn't want to untie. She put both front paws on the flannel and just breathed there, shaking. Umbrellas bloomed along the sidewalk, a slow bouquet of color and concern. Mr. DeWitt shuffled out in slippers, offering a mug he'd warmed between his hands. "For the girl," he said, setting it on the step like an altar. Rivera checked Mabel's gums with practiced fingers, quick and gentle. "A little chilled," she murmured. "No obvious injuries." "Warmth will do wonders." The man's eyes kept landing on every kindness like they were indictments. "I'm not a monster," he said to no one and everyone, the rain making applause no one wanted. Arthur shook his head. "You're a father trying to keep a roof." He tipped the towel, inviting Mabel to bring the rest of herself across the border. She did, back paws leaving the puddle slow as if it might feel abandoned. Arthur opened his front door, heat spilling out carrying the faint smell of cinnamon toast. The kitchen light threw a yellow path over the porch, soft as a memory. "Inside," he said. Not a command, more a direction you give to hope. The kid's hands slid under the towel, learning the careful lift from feeling alone. Mabel's weight surprised them, both a whisper, heavier than fear. The man took a step forward, then stalled at the threshold like it charged a toll. "Just until she's warm," Arthur offered, stepping aside, making space without making a point. Miss Rivera nodded, wet hair dripping a steady metronome on the mat. The neighbors leaned back into their doorways, the town exhaling as the scene softened. The storm finally settled into a steady tap, like someone thinking with their fingers. "No," the man said, the word flat, scared of what agreeing might mean tomorrow. The kid froze mid-lift, Mabel's heart fluttering against their wrists like a moth. "Dad," they tried, the word tenderized by months of choosing silence. 10 minutes, Arthur said, "and coffee. You can watch the whole time." Pride moved under the man's coat like a muscle, with a mind of its own. Ms. Rivera put a hand on his sleeve, anchoring without pinning. "It's safer inside." He looked at the towel, at the cat, at the small ring of faces holding a gentle line. The kid stood, legs unsteady, and turned toward the lighted doorway. The man's mouth opened to call them back, a note gathering at the back of his throat. A wind gust found the chime by Arthur's window, and it answered with a hollow, urging sound. They stepped onto the porch, and the old boards answered with a tired groan. The kid shifted Mabel closer, towel snug, breath mingling with the cat's thin warmth. Arthur reached past to hold the door, palm finding the familiar nick in the wood. A heavy hand slammed against the frame, not rough, just desperate, stopping the swing. The porch light flickered once, twice as the transformer down the block sighed out. Darkness slid over the yard in a single soft sheet, swallowing the small yellow path. In the sudden night, Mabel stiffened, claws catching the weave, the towel slipping. Arthur felt the shape of her weight change, a tiny balance tipping toward empty air. Somewhere beyond the hedge, an engine door thudded and a voice called, low and urgent. "Arthur, don't move, hold her right there." The dark settled like velvet soaked in rain, swallowing porch and street at once. "Arthur?" The voice came again, closer now, a clean edge in the muddle. Ms. Rivera rounded the hedge with a headlamp, snapping a white ribbon across the steps. Her hands were up the way you approach pain, open, unthreatening, sure. "Hold her steady," she said, and the beam slid to the tremble under the towel. Arthur planted his feet, every tendon learning the lesson of stillness. The kids stood frozen, breath cupped in their mouth, eyes tracking Mabel's small shape. The man braced an elbow to the doorframe, his phone screen a weak blue moon. A far transformer hummed and popped, a tired giant deciding whether to wake. Mabel clung to the weave, a pocket of heartbeat in a world gone blank. Rivera set a small carrier on the mat, its door already warm from a snap pack inside. "We'll make a tunnel," she murmured, draping the blanket from Arthur's arms to the crate. The beam skimmed their fingers, then pooled like quiet at the carrier's mouth. "Mame again," she said to the kid without looking up. "Mabel," they breathed, the syllables landing like a quilt across a cold bed. Arthur kept the towel taut, a low bridge between fear and shelter. The man lifted his phone higher, light steadying when his hand finally did. Rain stitched back into the picture as the neighborhood held its breath. Mabel sniffed the warmth, nose writing tiny wet commas on the fabric. She took one step, then another, the line of the puddle finally losing jurisdiction. Inside the carrier, she turned once, twice, and collapsed into the pocket of heat. The headlamp clicked down, and with it came a collective exhale that fogged the night. As if on cue, the porch light fluttered back, timid at first, then brave. Power climbed the block like dawn, windows blinking awake, refrigerators clearing their throats. Arthur felt his hands again and realized they were shaking like paper. "In," Ms. Rivera said, and the word opened a door bigger than the door. The kid followed, wet sneakers chirping over the threshold, face softening into relief. The man paused, then came to, pride folding itself small enough to fit inside. The carrier sat down on the kitchen table, the old wood taking the weight like a secret. Cinnamon and heat, and the faint, tinny smell of tuna braided into a welcome. Miss Rivera worked in the soft light. Thermometer, towel, a rhythm that soothed even the clock. "Mildly chilled, underweight, dehydrated," she said, counting breaths like rosary beads. "But she's young and stubborn, and that's medicine," she added, mouth finding a crooked smile. The kid touched the grate with one finger, apology and love sharing the same nerve. The man stood behind them, shoulders not as square, eyes somewhere he hadn't visited in years. "I told them we couldn't," he said, words heavy, not loud, breaking like thaw. "I drove 3 blocks and parked," he admitted, and hated myself the whole time. Arthur nodded, hearing a confession made to more than just the room. "We wreck things trying to survive," he said, the sentence arriving like a chair pulled out. "Tonight we survived gentler," he finished, surprised at how much of his wife was in it. Miss Rivera snapped a lid on a shallow dish, warming it with her palms before pouring. "Small sips," she said, sliding water forward, the ring of light holding steady. Mabel lapped, then blinked, then purred, a low motor catching after a long winter. The sound filled the kitchen in a way radiators used to in old apartments. Mr. DeWitt arrived a beat later with a litter box, like magic that smelled like pine. Someone texted, and within minutes a trail of help found the stoop like migrating birds. A bag of kibble, a toy mouse, a blanket knit in blue squares with someone's mistakes. The man looked at the pile, at strangers' kindness, and finally let his face crumple. He covered his eyes with the heel of his hand, just long enough to tell the truth. "I can't keep her," he said, "but I can't lose her either." Arthur felt the old emptiness in his house tilt, making room rather than making echoes. "Let me be the place," he said, and the room stilled as if listening to rain again. The kid looked up fast, hope startling like a bird from a bush. "She can stay here," Arthur continued, finding steadiness in the saying. "You come after school, on Saturdays, for feeding and foolishness and stories." Ms. Rivera nodded, businesslike mercy. "I'll handle shots, spay, the whole to-do." Mr. DeWitt tapped his chest. "I've got a spare scratching post and a fixable lamp." The man lowered his hand, regret and relief finally learning each other's faces. "Are you sure?" he asked, and the question made him look smaller and more human. "I've been waiting on something I could carry," Arthur said. "Turns out it's 12 ounces. Papers weren't needed, only numbers exchanged, promises made in ink and in eyes. The kid opened the carrier, slow, giving choice the respect it had earned. Mabel stepped onto the table like a pilgrim testing land, damp paws leaving incomprehensible maps. She crossed Arthur's forearms and pressed her chest to his sweater, purr digging in. He felt the vibration find his ribs and loosen something locked behind them. "Hi there," he whispered, the same way he had to the empty room on mornings. The man reached and scratched behind one ear, learning gentleness with practice. "Thank you," he said to Arthur, to the block, to the small life that made them kinder. "We'll be back tomorrow," the kid added, voice brighter, already planning a future. Outside, the rain faded to memory, the street rinsed and ready. Later, when the dishes were stacked and the carrier sat open like an invitation, surprise arrived. Mabel nosed along the baseboard, then darted to a pair of slippers waiting by the mat. She climbed into the left one without ceremony and curled like a comma in a finished sentence. The neighbors laughed softly. The kid clapped a hand to their mouth. Even the man smiled. Arthur stood very still, the odd little throne filling with warmth against his arch. "She's staying," he said, not loud, not for anyone to agree or argue with. The clock over the sink kept good time, finally, the house breathing with him again. What happened next, people would say, was the shock of watching a stubborn heart turn. A cat who would not move stepped into a home and took it with a purr. And in that small, ordinary miracle, everybody found a reason to keep going.